Hello, I'm Cameron from HR.com. If you are joining us for the first time today, welcome to day 4 of Inspire. Have a look around and tune into the valuable sessions and networking times. Check out the event navigation guide to get the most out of the event. I will post a link to the exit survey in the chat area, and the presentation slides will be available in the archive version of this event on HR.com. If you have any questions during the session, simply add them in the Q&A on your webinar controls. There will be time for live answers at the end of the session. You will also notice the chat feature, which you may use to engage with attendees and panelists. We love hearing your comments. This session is How Your Hiring Process May Be Blocking Your Diversity Initiative, presented by Jennifer Tardy. Jen is a career success coach, diversity recruiting expert, and international speaker. She owns and operates the Maryland-based Jennifer Tardy Consulting, JTC, an award-winning diversity recruiting consulting organization that brings job seekers and hiring professionals to the table to forge career success and hiring success. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Jennifer.
Well, thank you. And no matter where you are, good afternoon, good morning, good day. So I want to first thank HR.com for bringing us all together today. I'm truly excited to be here to talk about such an important topic. And you'll see, just like was stated by Cameron, how your hiring process may be blocking your diversity initiative. But I always put that under the umbrella of the state of diversity recruiting. And so what I do want to share with you is that, over the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on a journey. And I presented this presentation a few times before, and people always tell me, hey, Jennifer, there's so much learning in here. So I say it this way, that this is a journey. And when we begin to think about the state of diversity recruiting collectively, my goal is to not only help you to understand why this work is important, but to also unpack what the work is and where you as a leader hold accountability in helping your organization to meet the initiative to increase diversity. Now, to get here, I need to give you a quick Dni Crash Course, and then we'll talk about the struggle marginalized groups face, and then I'll unpack where bias hides in the hiring process. I'll even talk about how bias preserves underrepresentation. And then finally, I'm going to share with you some recommendations on what you can do as a leader to disrupt bias in order to increase diversity. And I usually spend a little bit of time giving a little bit of background about me, but one thing that I will point out is that at the end of the day, even though the work that our firm does is with two audiences, people who are on their job search and while we're working with employers to help them to increase diversity. I am a recruiter at heart. And so a lot of the work that I do, it allows us to stay very closely connected to recruiting practices. Now, I mentioned a second ago that in order to take you on this journey today, I wanted to do a quick crash course. My intention is to share with you some terms that you're going to hear me use today. Now, just know these are not new terms. They're just more inclusive ways of using terms that we've heard before. So let me give you an example. Let's start with the first one. Diverse means different. Diversity means variety. So one thing must be in context to another. I cannot be diverse alone, but we can be diverse. Diversity is not because of me, it is because of us. So remember, diversity is within a group, not within a person. Here's another very important concept. Diversity includes everyone. And that is why understanding underrepresentation is critical. Underrepresentation focuses on specific populations where the supply of these groups in the workforce is greater than the representation of these groups in our workplaces. Now, when we talk about historical underrepresentation or historically underrepresented groups, specifically in the US, we tend to talk about women, people of color, veterans, people with disabilities, people identifying as LGBTQIA+. In understanding that they also have had a harder time historically gaining access to workplace opportunities. So now when we talk about increasing diversity, I'm really intentional to place an emphasis on underrepresentation because, and remember this, there are also still spaces where when we talk about increasing diversity or increasing representation, there are places where we are talking about heterosexual, able-bodied, white, cisgender men. And an example that I like to use is even in the industry that I'm in diversity and inclusion. To increase diversity within our industry means increasing representation among this particular population. So I hope that that kind of brings it together so you can understand why I'm using the language that I'm using. And while we're talking about language, the language that we use when we're talking about this work is so important because it either has the power to move us all forward or it has the power to leave some feeling behind. And then with the acceptance of so much ineffective language, we've been leaving a lot of people behind. So I want you to write this down. Diversity includes everyone, but underrepresentation highlights the gaps. Diversity includes everyone, but underrepresentation highlights the gaps, which takes me to my next point in this crash course. Underrepresentation didn't just happen. You know, although we like to think that we woke up one day and we just have levels of underrepresentation within our organizations. Historically, there were intentional, deliberate, and overt, and often discriminatory mechanisms used to preserve underrepresentation. Now, since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it has helped in making discrimination illegal, but there's still a ton of work that has to be done to increase representation. And so what we have to begin thinking about now is, although there may not be as many overt practices that are preserving underrepresentation, there's still a lot of covert or a lot of things that maybe we may not always recognize. And that's where we begin to talk about bias. And when we talk about bias, we're talking about ways in which we've all been conditioned over centuries that have fueled this bias that we're still trying to unpack, understand, and disrupt today. But bias, simply stated, are preconceived opinions in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared to another. And the challenge with bias is that it is also connected to these collective agreements that we've long held on to regarding standards. And as we begin to place this into context of the hiring process, we begin to think, for example, about standards of professionalism. Standards of professionalism. Have you ever asked yourself, where did I first learn what professional looks like? And so we're going to begin talking about this throughout the presentation, but there's one other element that, as a part of this crash course, that I want to take a moment to talk about too, which is systems. Now, maybe you've already heard a lot about systems, and if you haven't, here's a really quick, oversimplified lesson to kickstart this journey. First, when we talk about systems, we're talking about the policies, practices, and behaviors according to which something gets done. Some of the most powerful systems in the world, to put this into context, you have the housing system, you have the criminal justice system, mass media, you have the educational system, you have the healthcare system. These are huge systems. And there are two sides of the coin here. On one side, there are things that we're doing to preserve the system, right? And then on the other side, we are also experiencing a system. So we're working the system and we're experiencing the system. So as humans, we are tied to these systems, or more specifically, our outcomes, such as the quality of life, our sense of safety and security, and even opportunity are tied to these systems. These systems can put individuals at an advantage or a disadvantage based on our ability to access the system and to navigate the system. So I think this is a good moment. I want to put in our first poll question. And so we're going to put up this poll question, and I'd like for you to answer. There's another major system in America. Which system is this, the other system? Is it the telephone system, the employment system, the research system? See, I'm making this pretty easy for you. So go ahead and put your answers in there. And it looks like we are getting a lot of responses for B. And so thank you. So we're going to go ahead and close that poll out. And 93% of you said the employment or the hiring system. And that is correct. And that is where I come in place because we begin talking, the world that I live in is really in unpacking what this employment system is and helping employers to understand the challenges of job seekers as they're trying to navigate. And then on the other end, I'm helping job seekers to navigate these systems so that they can get this access. So when I'm training recruiters and leaders, I often say this: you have top level access to one of the most powerful systems that impact the outcome of human lives. You have access to the hiring system. Some people tie the system of hiring and the system of wealth together because one supports the generation of the other. That is how powerful this is. And having access to the hiring system is having the power to decide who gets access to a job that can put money in their pockets. The money that goes into their pockets is tied to the money that supports their homes and their families, which is tied to the money that's poured into the neighborhoods and communities, which is tied to the money that fuels states and ultimately economies. So I want you to take a moment and consider just how powerful you are in your role, especially if in some manner you have access to the hiring system. You have access to a system that has such a deep impact on society and the outcome of lives. That's powerful. And in order to be effective in diversity recruiting, you have to be positioned in a way where you can best influence the hiring system so that there's fairer and more equitable access to get hired and also to get promoted. So our systems, specifically in the context of a hiring system, again, it is doing exactly what it was designed to do over the course of the previous 4 centuries. It was designed to exclude, exploit, and even oppress groups that were not at that time considered white and male. In other words, the hiring system was designed to be an obstacle course. And the truth is, as I mentioned on the previous slide, even though many of the policies, practices, and behaviors have changed, in large part due to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's still long-standing bias within this hiring system. Now, many people often find out about our firm, JTC, today because we have a growing newsletter on LinkedIn. We're about 35,000 strong, but our newsletter is called Increase Diversity. And one of the first articles that we wrote was called The Hiring System, which was a 5-part composite case study that really demonstrates the career experience of being ambitious, but always being reminded that you're different. And all of this while trying to journey to the top of your career. And so when I wrote this 5-part article series, I created a character and we named the character Keisha. And one of my favorite excerpts, which was in part 1 of the article, it was the part that took me the longest to write, as a matter of fact. It's when I describe the hiring system. And I took this excerpt out so that I could share it with you today. So let me just indulge you in reading it out loud. Here's what it says. To have a career, Keisha must interact with the hiring system and all of the policies, practices, and behaviors with which companies comply to preserve it. The hiring system has a series of mental and emotional obstacles that can be covert and overt. This obstacle course creates a roller coaster for Keisha, who constantly battles a war of two worlds. In one world, she wrangles in an internal dialogue of, am I enough? And in another world, she encounters external perceptions put upon her whereby others question, is she enough? And the only way to get through this obstacle course is to navigate it well. Navigating the hiring system can mean jumping over landmines of appropriate versus inappropriate, dodging microaggressions, swimming through unconscious biases, and balancing the tightrope walk of assimilation versus authenticity, just to be likable and to make others feel comfortable. And I'll flip over to this slide because there are certain points that I've highlighted in this image that I'm hoping, as I read through that excerpt, most resonated with you too. And here's my point as we continue our journey. As a leader, you have direct access to the hiring system. And because of this, you have a responsibility to disrupt the bias that hides in these policies, practices, and behaviors that make up the hiring system so that more groups that have been historically untapped are able to fairly access and compete for opportunities within your organization. Now, the ironic part here is that companies are funneling hundreds and often hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe even millions of dollars, into recruitment efforts with the goal of increasing diversity within their organization. But these same groups of individuals are being funneled through a hiring process with all of these obstacle courses that are knocking them out. So I'm hoping that you're starting to see the connection now. And this is one of the reasons why when companies are coming to me for consultations and they're saying, hey, Jen, tell us about a new job board. Tell us about an event that we should go to. Tell us about all of the things that we can do, that we can start doing to increase diversity. But then I will slow down the conversation just a little bit. And then I'll say, it's not just about what you must start doing when it comes to increasing diversity. This conversation is also about what you must stop doing, because it's in some of the things that we're doing currently that are creating the obstacles. Make sense? So if it makes sense, let me do a quick check-in. Drop me either a yes or a hell yes in the chat. So if where we are today in this conversation is making sense for you so far, drop me a yes or a hell yes. Okay, good, yes, perfect. I was like, uh-oh, are people hearing me? Okay, good. Thank you. Now I'll have to close out the chat because I get really distracted. Now I'll have a whole conversation just with you through the chat. All right, so let's keep pushing forward, which takes me to the core of what I really love talking about. In one way or another, I tend to get this question often from employers. They want to know, where does bias hide within the hiring system? Or more specifically, the hiring process, or even more specifically, they're like, where does it hide in our hiring process? So what I like to do here is an easy way for me to explain where bias hides within the hiring process is by breaking up the hiring process into milestones. And I like to use these 4 milestones. We have find, attract, assess, and select. So find which is all the sourcing that we do to find qualified individuals. Attract is, well, once we found them, how do we begin to attract them to our organization to make them even want to apply? And then assess is all the ways in which we assess individuals for their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then select is our ability to make an effective selection decision. Now, on the next few slides, I'm going to share with you examples of where bias hides in each of the hiring milestones to give you an idea of how to identify the bias in your own hiring process. And so I'll put these in forms of questions that in each milestone, I want you to be able to ask so that you can identify it yourself. But also just know that, that all of these questions, these sample questions, I'm taking from my overall ebook. And you don't worry about figuring out where the ebook is now, because I'll make sure that you'll know how you can find it later as well too. So let's first start with find, okay? And we'll go to our next polling question. And our next polling question is, when you are looking for candidates, what is your preferred sourcing method to find candidates? Is it job sites like Glassdoor, LinkedIn, or jobs.com? Is it higher education campuses, like you're actually building relationships on campuses? Are you going to career fairs on those campuses? Or maybe it's just something else that you're doing that's not one of these three above. Okay, so I'm looking, if you see me looking this way, it's because that's where my monitor is. I'm not ignoring you. And so as we're looking at the poll, it looks like most people, 68%, they're looking at places like LinkedIn, sourcing there for candidates. And then the next up, other. So some of you are doing some other things. So awesome. So we will go ahead and close this poll out. And I always like to drop in a little bit of data. So I'll share a little bit of data with you right now. According to online recruitment statistics, people are very trusting of websites that post job ads, such as Glassdoor, LinkedIn, and jobs.com. These websites are the preferred method of slightly more than half of job seekers, regardless of whether they currently have a job or not. And hearing about a job opportunity from a friend, around 45% of people, that's how they hear about them, and finding it on a company's career site, which is about 35% of people, are the next most common methods of discovering open positions. And if you post jobs, right? If you post jobs as an employer, where you post jobs and how you post job openings affects the accessibility candidates have to your open positions. So in order for candidates to apply to your open positions, your roles must be visible and accessible to the audience you're targeting. The clearer you are about your audience, and in this context, we're talking about increasing diversity and diversity recruiting, the clearer you are about where you want to increase representation, the more targeted your strategy can be on which techniques to use to advertise your job opening. So here are some questions that you can ask as you're evaluating your level of accessibility of your job postings. First, does your recruiting team only have partnerships with universities that are alma maters of their senior leaders? Then, what if your senior leaders are all white, for example? What if all of the universities that they graduated from are also historically white universities? Will these partnerships help you to increase representation? Another question, are some opportunities posted for specific individuals? And when was the last time you said, or maybe you heard someone say, find me someone just like X? What if most of your hiring managers approached their job opportunities the same way? What if most of the someone just like, what if they were all alike? Will this strategy help you to increase diversity? And then, and here's a really important question. Are the job boards that you're posting your roles to, or where you're sourcing, are they overrepresented in the same areas you are already overrepresented within your company? Will this help you to increase diversity? Probably not. Now, let's move on to attract. Here's more data for you. 75% of job seekers consider an employer's brand before ever applying for a job. 52% of candidates first seek out, number one, the company's website, and number two, social media to learn more about an employer. Candidates actually trust company employees 3 times more than the company to provide credible information on what it's like to work there. And that's information that I gathered from LinkedIn. So understand this. People have a desire to apply and work in a great environment, and the varying ways in which a good work environment is defined. But when people begin talking more specifically about women, people of color, people with disabilities, people who identify as LGBTQ+, these populations, for example, want to know that no matter how unique they are to what's already represented, or often overrepresented as the look of success within your organization, that they want to know that they'll still feel included and that they can still succeed while working there. Candidates look for signs of diversity as a promise of inclusion, and they look for signs of inclusion as a promise of equity, and they look for signs of equity as a promise of a great work experience. So here's some questions that you can ask as you're evaluating your company's employment brand and its ability to attract untapped populations. First, what are candidates learning about what it's like to work at your company from people who identify most similarly to them? Second, are any of the company leaders acknowledging or being transparent about the lack of diversity and how the organization got to a place of underrepresentation and what it plans to do to increase diversity? Just those conversations and hearing those things from senior leaders helps to create a state of inclusion. It helps your organization to figure out, here's how we got here, and here's what we need to do differently. The more we start to hear senior leaders being open and transparent about it. And then last, do candidates have information readily available about employee resource groups or affinity groups, as an example? So that's attract. Now let's talk about assess. 92% of tech founders say that they know about unconscious bias in hiring, but only 45% are doing something about it, which is a challenge. Assessing candidate eligibility starts the moment the hiring team has access to information that provides details to a candidate's knowledge, skills, and experience, whether it's the resume, online profile, or even the application. So here's some questions that you can ask as you're assessing candidates during the hiring process. First, do all applications that are submitted before the posting deadline at least get reviewed, or are some ignored and overlooked? And I'll talk about that in a second, because as I'm working with employers through consulting, one of the first things that we begin looking at as we're unpacking the data is what percentage of applications that come through aren't ever evaluated. And I understand why, having been a recruiter, but when we tend to look at those applications demographically, we're also finding that if we're looking to increase representation, let's say like racial representation, then we're finding that there are higher numbers in who's getting overlooked or ignored. So the second question is, does your recruiter or interview team consider candidates less qualified, for example, simply because maybe English is a second language? Or do you continuously audit your assessments or the tests that you're using to check for adverse impact? Something to ask yourself. And now as we begin talking about the fourth milestone, which is select, here's another quick, some data for you. According to an Inc.com article, on average, every corporate job opening attracts around 250 resumes, but only 4 to 6 of these people will be called in for an interview, and only 1 of those will be offered a job. Now, to make a solid selection decision requires an effective job description. That's one thing. It requires an effective interview team. Number 2, it requires effective assessment techniques. Number 3, then here's something that often gets missed. It requires meaningful feedback. Without one of these 4 key inputs that I talk about in our training, the output, or those selected or rejected for the role, it's likely to be subject to bias or to be vulnerable to bias seeping in. So here are questions that you can ask as you're making a selection decision. Does your recruiter or hiring manager accept if there's no feedback? Do they accept vague feedback from the interview team members? If yes, then you're likely missing one of the inputs that's needed to make an effective selection decision. And then, does your company allow nepotism, cronyism, and favoritism when making decisions or exceptions on who can get employed at your company? When we think about nepotism, we're thinking about hiring family members. When we think about cronyism, we're thinking about hiring people, specifically, or appointing people because you know them, they're in your network. And then we already know about favoritism. You're my favorite person, so you're going to get the opportunity for the next opportunity. And then the last question, are your hiring managers able to solicit and embed hearsay feedback about candidates from personal and professional networks when making a selection decision? I'm going to share a philosophy that I share with participants that I train. As we begin thinking about making an effective selection decision, rather than thinking about just one factor when making that final selection decision, I want you to think about 2 factors and take this as a freebie on me, because this is really valuable if you're able to get it and apply it. So at JTC, we call this our 2-factor selection decision model. It requires you to really rethink this idea of value. So currently, we may hire someone based on the value that they can bring to the role, and that's really good. Keep doing that. It's a great factor upon which to assess candidates. It's our way of asking, do they meet or exceed the basic qualifications? Do they meet or exceed the desired qualifications? But understanding that that's only one factor. Here's the second factor in the 2-factor selection decision model. What value? So we already talked about first factor, what value do they bring to the role? The second factor is what value do they bring to the organization? In order to answer that, you have to know what your organization values. As an example, do you value diversity? Do you value what diversity brings to an organization? Do you value the untapped perspectives of underrepresented voices? Then consider that value. Whenever I say that, I also have to follow up really quickly with, here's my disclaimer that I want everyone to hear me say. We hire based on the value a person brings to the role and to an organization. We do not hire because of the way a person identifies. Hiring a person because they are a Black woman, for example, is just as illegal as it is to not hire someone because they are a Black woman. Remember that. The benefit is an understanding that as an intersectional human being, in other words, in this example, being identifying as Black and identifying as a woman, the intersection of the two, it brings with it unique experiences and perspectives and considerations. And therein lies the value. It's within those lived experiences that they bring because of how they identify. but you're hiring because of those lived experiences, because of the perspectives, that it increases your overall perspective and what you consider within your organization. And I hope that that makes sense. So now that I've talked about these 4 milestones that I promised you, I do want to share a quick bonus milestone that I want you to consider. And this is around internal hiring. And some of it thinks of, and some people may think of this as in promotions. But let me just share something really quick, some other data too. LinkedIn's recent talent trends study conducted between January and March of 2016 with more than 26,000 professionals showed that about 25% of professionals today have their eye on promotions. They don't want to leave their company. Instead, they want to stick around and move up the ranks. The problem is the research also shows that being overlooked for promotion is the reason that 24% of employees say that they're open to jobs elsewhere. Now, the previously mentioned data demonstrates that there is an issue with the internal hiring obstacle course, with internal hiring, that there is an obstacle course internally as people are trying to get access to new opportunities once they join your company. New opportunities could be a promotion, it could be a lateral move, or it could just be a short-term, highly visible project too. Now, the biggest part when we're talking about one of our audiences that we work with as a career coach when we're working with job seekers, it isn't in helping untapped communities to get access to jobs. We spend more of our time helping these individuals get access to internal opportunities after they're employed. Getting access to promotions, lateral opportunities, and major projects still has its own hurdles for marginalized groups. And so increasing diversity at all levels within a company means being transparent about the qualifications it takes to get to the next level and creating an equitable internal hiring process that all employees have access to. Too often, as I'm entering different organizations and doing consulting work, I hear from employees who are saying that they have no clue how to get to the next level, and they become discouraged watching their peers get promoted with no transparent reason. So here are a few questions that you can ask as you're evaluating your company's policies on internal opportunities. One question, do you help new hires understand the culture and the language of the company? Or do you have conversations about written and unwritten performance expectations for new employees? And do you connect new hires to communities that represent their stated interests? A lot of times when I'm training recruiters, I begin to also talk about onboarding, and recruiters, and I would have thought the same thing too, like, why in the world are you talking to me about onboarding? As a recruiter, the only thing that I'm responsible for is getting butts in seats, right? Getting people hired into positions. But how people enter organizations also helps with retention and also helps to get them positioned for opportunities in the future within the company that may open up. So onboarding is just as important too. Now, in order to bring all of this home in this jam-packed presentation, there's one more stop that we're going to make along our journey to increasing diversity. We've already talked about the bias and where it hides in the hiring process, but how does all of this actually play out in real life? So I mentioned that on our team, with our consulting arm, employers will partner with us to review their data, usually their hiring data or their candidate data, to identify where bias is showing up in their hiring process. And the best way for us to deliver upon this promise to find out where people are falling out of the hiring process is if a company collects self-ID data via a self-ID campaign. And so if you haven't heard of a self-ID campaign before, it's just a way of encouraging candidates to volunteer to identify themselves. And typically you have categories like race, ethnicity, veteran status, disability status, and even gender identity. And so this is during the application process when they're applying into your organization. So just know that when candidates self-identify, it allows us to find leaks in your hiring process. In other words, I want to know who gets ahead in your hiring process and who gets left behind, who progresses to the next step, all the way to getting hired, and then who gets left behind by way of either being rejected or withdrawing from your process. So think of the self-ID campaign as a way of looking back in order to know how to move forward. Here's our next polling question. Just because I'll get to my nosy question in a second, but this polling question is, where do you think you are losing most of your candidates? So are you losing them because they're not showing up on the start date like they said they would? Are they voluntarily withdrawing before an offer is being presented to them? Do they accept the offer and then they renege on that offer? They're like, psych, I said I was going to do it, but I'm not going to start working at your company. Do you extend the offer and they decline the offer, which is D? Are they being rejected? Or is it E? Are they being overlooked? I should have had one that said, or is it F? Or is it G? I don't know. Like, I have no clue where people are falling out. Okay, we'll give it us another second. So let's lock this in. It looks like 45% said we're losing candidates because they're being overlooked. That's deep. Or 24% said they're being rejected. And what I want you to know is that if you're one of the ones that said, overlook or being rejected, you're among good company, because many employers, once we begin to look at the data, this is what we're finding as well too. And we'll go ahead and close this one out. And so if you didn't know the answers to that poll question, that's okay. However, I challenge you to collect data to find out the answer, because it may surprise you. Now, when we say that we're searching for leaks in your talent pipeline by reviewing demographic data, we're looking at where people are being rejected and where people are withdrawing. So common leaks include being rejected, getting overlooked, meaning the recruiter moved. Let's talk about this for a second, because I know that I mentioned being overlooked a couple of times. This is when a recruiter may decide to move forward. A position is open for 2 weeks, right? It's posted, open, live. But in that first week, the recruiter may decide to go in and look for who's most competitive today. And then they'll take those candidates. Sorry, one second. Get a little bit of water here. And then they'll take those candidates and they'll move them forward in the hiring process. Now, if they're not competitive enough, they'll come back to the initial pool and they'll look at the rest of the candidates. What if the hiring manager is like, oh, I love this candidate or these candidates. Let's keep things moving forward. That is one of the main ways we have this pool of people who get overlooked, because in the proactivity, which good intentions by the recruiter, they've gone ahead and moved some people forward, but didn't look at the rest of the individuals. Okay, so that's what the getting overlooked is. Then we have the withdrawing voluntarily, declining the offer, accepting the offer, and later reneging or not showing up for the hire date as promised. And with each of these leaks, when we go in, we are looking for why, right? So as an example, we're saying, well, how many candidates applied but never had their application reviewed? Okay, of those candidates, how many of them are from historically underrepresented groups? Okay, then why were they never reviewed? Is there a reason behind it? And this is where we get into the qualitative side. We're talking to recruiters, we're talking to hiring managers, and then what can we recommend by way of process improvement? So this is really important. And so let's get to the very next polling question, because this is where I get to be nosy. This question says, my organization currently, in A, we do not collect self-ID data. B, We collect self-ID data, but we haven't really started analyzing it yet. You know how you whisper that when we really haven't started analyzing it yet. Or C, we collect and we analyze self-ID data, but we don't really do anything with it. We don't process improve with it. Or we collect, we analyze, and we process improve with the data. Okay. Okay. All right, let's lock them in. And so most people fall into B, we collect self-ID data, but we haven't really started looking at it. And that's generally where I find the organizations that I'm working with, that they're in B as well too, that they're collecting it, which is awesome. That's the first step. But ideally, I want you, I invite you all to be in category 4, where we collect it, we analyze it, and we process improve with it. Let me close this out over here. But here's another point. If you are still in category number 1, it may be likely that your organization is thinking about the risks associated with adverse impact, or, if I know that something is going wrong, it sets us up for liability as an organization. So if we don't know, we're not held accountable. That it's very likely, because I've seen organizations that are in that space as well too. And so because they're thinking about, again, adverse impact, they're thinking about the 4/5 rule and things like that. But here's what I want to share with you. I haven't seen, and maybe other people have, but I haven't seen any other way to really get closer to understanding what's happening within your talent pipeline unless you begin collecting it. So as a matter of fact, I want you to consider these benefits to a self-ID campaign that can support your journey to increasing diversity. One is that understanding the demographic makeup and what's happening in your hiring process helps to facilitate dialogue around applicant pools. Have we increased representation enough with that mirrors who's available? And it also helps you to identify hiring challenges and barriers. Number 3, it helps you to better provide support and resources for candidates. So, for example, if I'm working with an organization and I notice that that many of your veterans, people who are identifying as a military veteran, that they're falling out or they're leaking out of your hiring process, they're unable to proceed from submitting their application to getting a phone screen, then maybe there's an opportunity to do a community workshop to help veterans to better translate their resume to civilian resumes. And then you're able to do that to be able to process improve with it. It also helps you to evaluate your hiring process for leaks. And then it allows you to measure your success with data as well too. Here's another question that I get often. If I, meaning those who are on the front lines of recruiting, recruiters, hiring leaders, hiring teams, if I have all of this power and all of this access because of my role, then what's next? As a leader, what can I do to help? So there are 4 things that I want to share with you. Number 1, one of the first things that I share with people is to check yourself. When I first heard these words, it was in context to diversity and inclusion, and I was working on one of my certifications, and the teacher said that the first step in entering the world of diversity and inclusion is to check yourself. And my immediate response was, check myself. What do I need to check myself about? So if you're anything like me, again, you're in good company as well, because my first thought was, what on earth could I possibly need to check myself about? And the idea behind this action item was that in order for us to enter the world of diversity and inclusion fully, we must first deal with those things that remain unresolved inside of us. In other words, one of the ways that we check ourselves is by addressing our own resistance. So here at JTC, we believe that the easiest way to explain the idea of resistance is this. It's opposition to a natural flow. When you are in your natural element, the way is clear. But to feel opposition means that something is blocking your natural flow. As a matter of fact, I use this check yourself as a prerequisite to entering the work of diversity recruiting. Because to feel an opposition means that there's something that's preventing you from doing your part as a hiring professional to increase diversity. It can mean that you don't want to learn about where bias hides in the hiring process for fear that it will mean acknowledging things that maybe you've done incorrectly in the past. Opposition could mean talking in a very generic or a politically correct way, avoiding saying exactly what you mean for fear of using the wrong word and for being called out, right? Nobody wants to be that person that's called out. Nobody wants to be that person that's responsible for the organization getting sued, right? So to check yourself means that you're willing to do the work to deal with your resistance. And sometimes the work is deeper learning. It could be cultural competence. Sometimes the work could be therapy, right? Or sometimes the work could be more immersive, meaning that you're able to immerse yourself into experiences that are outside of your own based on how you identify. And so if you scan the QR code next to the word check yourself, there's a free reflection activity that can help you to identify your own resistance if you like to take that step. We actually have workshops around it, but for the sake of time, you can just go ahead and take that worksheet. The second thing that I recommend is to understand as a leader where you hold accountability because of your role. Always remember this: the person who makes the final selection decision is the person held accountable for the level of diversity within the organization. As the decision maker, you are the gatekeeper to who gets access to opportunities at your company. Now, to clarify, as a hiring manager, you're often the final decision maker. Now, when I'm training recruiters and hiring managers, I share that the recruiter is accountable for the diversity of the candidate pool that's presented to the hiring manager. So they must do a good job presenting a diverse slate of candidates so that you are able to make an effective selection decision. The interview team is accountable for helping to assess candidates and submitting meaningful, relevant feedback to help you in your final selection decision. But you, the hiring manager, get to own the most impactful role in inclusive hiring, and that's making the final selection decision. Number 3, normalize using recruiting data to identify bias. We've already talked about that, so I will not belabor that. But again, it's my other moment to say, I invite you to use data so that you can better understand what's happening in your own hiring process. And then number 4, which is something that I love talking about, which is audit your workplace environment. I would have never thought that I'd be talking about environment, especially when having been a recruiting leader. When we're talking about environment, it's usually around retention conversations. And retention wasn't really a recruiting issue, at least in my mind at the time. That's what I used to believe, but it very much is a recruiting issue. I had to actually make my own seat at the table as a leader so that I could weigh in on issues around retention. Oftentimes, I may have been the initiator of conversations about retention and the importance of reviewing retention data and looking at it from a demographic lens. But here's what I want you to know. There is no way to truly increase diversity if the same untapped groups and voices are leaving your organization as quickly as they're entering. So also remember that culture is an ideal. So it's an ideal that organizations are trying to reach, but and often with great intentions. However, on the road to this culture, your employees are experiencing many types of environments. And the environment is the impact. And so I want you to know that as an employer, while you're on the road toward creating an ideal culture, have you taken a moment to audit your environment? Ask yourself and your organization, who has access to the most coveted positions in your organization? Whose voice gets heard? Who can see themselves in leadership roles? Who receives mentoring and sponsorship? All of those questions, as tough as they are, can truly help you to take inventory about where you are on your own journey to reaching an ideal workplace environment where all people have access to those most coveted positions. All people have access to, feeling that their voice is heard, to being able to see themselves represented in leadership roles, to receive mentoring and sponsorship. But then, what's your reality? Something to think about. Okay, so that was a lot of information. Did you enjoy that information? Let me open this back up again. So if you enjoyed it, give me another yes. Give me, I don't think you can do thumbs up, but here's some things. Perfect. I'm so glad to see that. If you can take away certain things, here's what I want you to take away. Number one, diversity includes everyone. You see, I'm still looking at the chat box. Diversity includes everyone. Second, the hiring system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The hiring system can make the hiring process feel like an obstacle course for underrepresented groups. Bias is baked into the hiring system, but we have to be able to ask the right questions to identify it. Pay attention to where untapped talent is leaking out of your hiring process. And remember that as a leader, what you can do to increase diversity is to check yourself, understand where you hold accountability, normalize using recruiting data, and audit your workplace environment. And so I'll skip the challenge and because I know that we have about 4 or 5 minutes left where I can get a few questions answered, but there's a free tool that I have for everyone if you'd like to have a copy, which is the Platinum Checklist for Hiring Professionals. And it's 10 immediate things that you can stop doing to overall help to increase diversity in your organization. So grab one. And in the meantime, Cameron, do we have any questions from Q&A?
Yes, I see one in the Q&A and there's a few in the chat. Someone said this is the best session I have attended all week. Thank you.
Good.
Do you recommend any books that can help further increase learning or complement the seminar?
Yep. So I would one of the things that is the ebook that I was talking about a second ago, getting the free checklist, it'll tell you exactly where you can go to get the ebook, but there are 113 questions, just like the milestones that I was taking you through, that at each of those milestones is questions that you can begin asking to identify where bias is baked in. We spent a long time putting that together, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback where people are saying, I have it posted on my wall. So like every time I'm doing something, I'm looking at this. And so that's a good place to start.
And then I have another question in the chat. So how do we encourage self-ID? Our applicant asks it for all applications, but many select not to identify.
Yeah, and so one of the challenges here, and again, I'm working on both sides, as I'm talking with people who are on the job search, they're like, Jen, should I volunteer this information? I'm afraid that if I volunteer this information, that people may discriminate against me and things of that nature. And I have to debunk those myths that organizations who are collecting this are generally trying to process and prove with the information. They're trying to better understand what's happening. And then on the other end as well, too, as an employer, I recommend from that aspect, tell people how you're planning to use the data, why, how their ability to volunteer, how they identify, helps you as an organization toward your initiative to increase diversity. So I would spend more time within the section of the application, kind of setting it up. Maybe even a message from your CEO right there that talks about, the importance of it. Here's how you're using it as you're working to increase diversity overall.
Perfect. I have another question in the chat as well. I may have missed it, but what recommendations do you have for how organizations can start assessing their tests, tools, etc., for adverse impact if they don't know where to start?
What's interesting? So even as we begin talking about adverse impact, that it feels so heavy, and it's a real thing, right? It's a real thing. But let's put a pin in the idea of adverse impact. One of the things that's really important to me that I recommend to organizations is when you have tests, I want you to find people within your organization that is actually doing those jobs and doing those jobs well. Have them take the test. Let's see how they score. Let's see how they're doing. So that's one really quick way of being able to say that. And it's so interesting. Even with some of the questions that I'm finding that employers are asking during interviews, how would the people who are in the job doing the job successfully, how would they have, rated going through that interview as well too? So it's something to give a shot to give a try to.
Perfect. I think that's all the time that we have for today. So I would like to thank our presenter, Jennifer Tardy, for presenting this very informative webcast today. And thanks to you for attending. Your feedback is super important to us. So please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that will open in a new browser on your computer when you exit Zoom. You do have a few minutes before the next webcast begins, so you can visit the exhibit hall or grab a fresh cup of coffee or whatever your beverage of choice may be. We will be also sending an email with the credit information. You will find the credits on your View My Credits page of your membership profile once the webcast has been archived. So this concludes this webcast session. We hope you've been enjoying Inspire 2021. All virtual booths are available for the entire event, as well as a networking lounge, so take some time to look around and connect. Have a great day.